My name is Linda. I am 72 years old. I wear my hair short now, salt and pepper mostly, but it used to be long and thick like my mother's. I keep it neat. I've always believed that dignity is not about how rich you are or where you live, but how you hold yourself. My posture is still straight, despite the creaks in my knees, and I speak in a voice softened by time, but not erased by it. I was married for 45 years to a man named Walter. He was quiet, steady, a bit too fond of his pipe even after the doctor told him to stop. But he loved me. Not the kind of love you see in the movies. No grand gestures, no screaming matches under the rain. Ours was made of coffee mugs left warm on the table, coat buttons sewn back on without being asked, and silence that didn't need filling. When Walter passed, it was in the middle of the night. I woke up to an odd quiet. Not absence exactly, more like a shift, like the center of the house had moved. For days after, I walked from room to room looking for where it had gone. The silence was different without him. Not peaceful, empty. It was my daughter, Caroline, who suggested I move in with her. She framed it like a favor to her, not to me. Mom, it'll be easier. For the kids, too. They miss you, and the house is too big for you now, anyway. I remember standing in Walter's study, the one with the worn leather chair and the faded curtains, staring at the cardboard boxes lined up like soldiers. I told myself it was just a transition, that we'd figure things out together. Caroline and I were never close the way some mothers and daughters are. She's efficient, hardworking, a planner. She thrives on spreadsheets and calendars, and I've always been more of a recipe on an index card kind of woman. We don't argue, but we don't linger in each other's company either. When she was little, I used to wonder if she was simply born older than me, destined to parent herself. Her husband, Mike, is polite but distant. He never did like that, "I don't drive anymore." He says things like, "Oh, Linda, you didn't have to do the dishes." But I can tell it bothers him when I sit too long in the living room. Their kids, Owen and Ellie, are sweet, distracted children, 12 and 9. They love my stories when they listen. But mostly, they're wrapped up in headphones, phones, and YouTube stars I've never heard of. I moved into the room at the end of the hallway. It used to be the guest room. Caroline changed the linens and added a small desk. She said I could make it my own. And I tried. I put up a few photographs: Walter in the garden, my mother's embroidered daisies, the children in a pumpkin patch years ago. But the walls always felt like they belonged to someone else. Caroline was clear. Shared space is shared space. We all live here, she said. It has to feel balanced. So I paid half the rent. I didn't argue. I used my pension and some of the savings Walter left. I never complained when my laundry was left in the basket or when my apple pie was pushed behind the organic hummus in the fridge. I helped where I could. I cooked on Wednesdays, did school pickups when needed, and kept out of the way when Caroline had Zoom calls or Mike wanted the TV. I didn't ask for much, just a chair in the living room to sit in the evening, a corner by the window where the light came in just right. I never asked for my own spot on the couch. I just took it when no one else was around. And when guests came, I stood in the kitchen, poured wine, smiled. That's who I am. At least that's who I had been. Until the evening, everything shifted again. Not as loud as before, not tragic, just a soft, quiet thing, like a chair being moved, like a mother being asked to stand up. It was Caroline's birthday, 48, not a milestone, but enough of a number to warrant a gathering. She planned it meticulously, as she always does. Digital invitations, a charcuterie board mapped out in advance, a signature cocktail with rosemary sprigs clipped fresh from the planter box I had installed last summer on their balcony. I stayed out of the planning. She had her own ideas and preferred to execute them without suggestions. I used to host birthdays for her when she was a child. streamers, pink cakes, pin the tail on the donkey in the backyard. I thought about those while peeling apples that morning. That was my contribution. The pie. The one everyone always asked for. Flaky crust, tart Granny Smith's, a cinnamon touch that lingered. I made it from scratch, of course. No shortcuts. I even brushed the top with egg wash and sprinkled sugar crystals so it would glisten in the evening light. I placed it in the center of the kitchen island, hoping it would be noticed. Guests arrived slowly. Co-workers, neighbors, some school friends of Caroline's I vaguely recognized from PTA meetings 2 decades ago. They came bearing wine and tulips and store-bought desserts in shiny boxes. There were hugs, polite laughter, a thrum of conversation that filled every room. I wore a blue sweater Walter had once said made my eyes look younger. I stayed mostly in the kitchen, clearing wrappers, offering drinks, refilling napkin holders. Someone complimented the smell of the pie, but walked past it in favor of vegan brownies. When it began to get crowded, I slipped into the living room. My knees were starting to ache, and the arch in my back was asking for a break. I spotted a space on the couch just near the armrest and lowered myself gently into it. Not in the center, not in the spotlight, just a corner. I watched Caroline across the room, talking to a tall woman in a blazer. Her head was tilted back in laughter, wine glass poised in hand. She looked lovely, grown, confident. Not at all like the girl who used to tug on my apron strings asking for juice. And then she saw me. She came over, not loudly, not unkindly. "Mom," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Don't sit here. It's for the guests." There was no anger in her voice. That's what made it worse. It was casual, routine, like I should have known better, like I'd crossed a line I hadn't seen. I nodded, quietly. I stood up. No one said anything. No one offered me another seat. The room simply flowed around the moment as if it hadn't happened. Caroline returned to her conversation. The tall woman smiled and sipped her wine. I walked slowly to the kitchen. My stool was still by the counter, and I sat on it like I had 100 times before. I looked at the pie. No one had touched it. Not even a slice. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel hurt, at least not the sharp kind. It was something quieter, colder, like stepping into a room and realizing the furniture had been rearranged without you. I folded my hands in my lap. I watched as voices echoed through the hallway. I sat still, a blue sweater in a corner kitchen, next to a pie no one wanted, and for the first time in a long time, I stopped trying to be part of it. I stayed on that kitchen stool long after the sounds of the party began to swell again. I could hear the echo of a cork popping, someone laughing a little too loud, and Ellie running through the hallway in socked feet. Life resumed as if I had never entered the room at all. The pie sat untouched. Its sugar crystals, once sparkling in the light, looked dull now. It had cooled completely. The crust was perfect, golden, still crisp, but no one seemed to care. I imagined Caroline thinking it wasn't on theme, that it looked too traditional. I placed the pie knife beside it, just in case. A part of me still wanted to believe someone would notice, take a piece, say something kind. But no one did. I watched from the kitchen as people passed it by, as Caroline brought out her cake, a tall, pristine confection from a boutique bakery, pistachio sponge with rosewater cream, modern, elegant. The guests applauded as she cut into it. I listened to the chorus of delight at how light and sophisticated it was. I thought about the time 15 years ago when Caroline had begged me to make 2 apple pies for her wedding shower. She said it reminded her of home, of simpler times. She had cried when I told her I'd make them with extra cinnamon just for her. I remembered baking them in the middle of the night so they would be fresh. And now I was the person standing in the kitchen trying not to be in the way, A fixture, not a guest. That evening, after everyone left, I washed the wine glasses. I scrubbed the cutting boards, packed up the extra charcuterie, and folded the linen napkins. My knees hurt. My fingers were sore. I opened the refrigerator and saw the pie, still whole, still wrapped in the warmth of the memory it had tried to carry. I closed the fridge door slowly. Later, in the dim of my guest room lamp, I sat at my desk and opened a fresh page in my old spiral notebook. I don't usually keep a journal. I don't often write things down. But something in me needed to count. So I did. I listed, carefully, the last few years, line by line, $14,200 spent from my savings toward renovations, bathroom tiling, repainting, new cabinets, $3,000 for Owen's private tutoring when he was struggling with math, $2,500 for Ellie's summer camp so they wouldn't have to rearrange their schedules, biweekly grocery contributions, $200 per trip, monthly half share of rent, $850 for 3 years, then the intangibles, load after load of laundry folded quietly, Wednesday dinners every week, pickup runs in the rain, 3 illnesses nursed, Caroline's flu, Mike's shingles, Ellie's stomach bug, 42 apple pies. I didn't write this list in anger. I wasn't trying to build a case. I wasn't planning to wave it in anyone's face. I simply needed to see it, to understand how I had become someone so gently, so completely, edged out of the center of a life I helped hold together. I saw it not as betrayal, but as erosion. Soft, slow, unnoticed. That night, I turned off the light and lay in bed staring at the ceiling, not with bitterness, but with clarity. It wasn't a fall, it was a shift, just like when Walter died. Only this time, no one had left me. They had simply made a world where I no longer belonged. The morning after the party, the house was quiet again. Not the good kind of quiet, like when the kids were tucked in and the dishwasher hummed gently. This was the kind that echoed, a quiet full of absence. I moved through the kitchen with a strange alertness. I could still see the outline of wine glasses on the table, the dried bits of icing on the cake platter. The pie was gone. I found out later Caroline had tossed it in the trash, untouched, not angrily, just like it didn't belong. I sat by the window with a cup of tea and my notebook. I hadn't planned to write again, but I did. Only this time, not numbers, not costs. I wrote sentences. She used to come to me for help with everything. I used to be the center of someone's world. I was not invited. I was placed in a room at the end of the hall, in a kitchen corner, in the background of my own story. I thought of all the small requests that had slowly stacked over the years. Mom, could you watch the kids on Saturday? Mom, don't touch the thermostat. We're trying to keep it even. Mom, just text me first before using the car. I know you don't drive often. Mom, please don't talk about politics at the table. It makes Mike uncomfortable. Mom, stay in your room during the Zoom calls if you can. It's distracting. No one yelled, no one scolded, no one pushed me away with their hands. But I was pushed nonetheless, kindly, softly, repeatedly. There was a time I might have fought, demanded to be seen, but something inside me knew better now. At 72, I had no interest in shouting to be heard in a room where no one was listening. So I did something else. That week, I began taking quiet inventory of everything I still owned. Not just the pie dishes and linens and books, but the bigger things, the deeds, the accounts, the pieces of my life that had quietly continued to exist while I tried to disappear. The house, it was still in my name. My late husband and I had bought it before Caroline was born. When we moved out to the suburbs from our cramped rental in the city, he was so proud. He used to stand in the front yard and say, "This house will outlive us." We had kept it even after moving to Florida for retirement, renting it out to young couples until we eventually returned when Walter's health began to fail. When he passed, everything went to me. Caroline had suggested we revisit the title for convenience, but I never did. I opened the drawer in my nightstand. The deed was still there, under Walter's old reading glasses and a copy of Jane Eyre. I kept meaning to finish, and suddenly it became very clear. This house did not belong to them. It had never been theirs. They were living in something I had built, maintained, paid for, and yet I was being asked to move aside. Not rudely, not even intentionally, but steadily, strategically, as if I were an inconvenience. That realization didn't make me cry. It made me calm. It made me certain, and it made me ready. The next Tuesday, I took the bus downtown. It was a slow, gray morning, one of those where the clouds sit low over the buildings like a wet cloth, making everything seem a little heavier. I dressed carefully, not fancy but respectfully. Slacks, my good wool coat, and the brooch Walter had given me on our 30th anniversary, the one shaped like a leaf with tiny amethyst stones embedded in the veins. He used to say it made me look like autumn. I stepped off the bus 3 stops earlier than needed and walked the rest of the way. I don't know why. Maybe I needed the time to think. Maybe I just didn't want to seem like I had rushed. The law office was tucked above a bakery that smelled like warm sugar and cinnamon. Ironic, I thought, considering what had happened with the pie. A bell jingled as I entered the small, slightly worn waiting area. There were chairs lined up against the wall, all filled with quiet people looking at their phones or the floor. The receptionist glanced up at me, young, sharp eyeliner, short bob. "Hi there, do you have an appointment?" she asked. "Yes, for 10 o'clock. Linda Hargrave." "Great, you're with Mr. Colby. He'll be right out." Mr. Colby appeared 5 minutes later, mid-40s, kind face, no tie. He offered his hand, and I shook it with the same firmness my father had taught me. We went into a warm office with bookshelves stacked more for effect than use, framed certificates on the wall, the smell of fresh paper. "What can I help you with today, Mrs. Hargrave?" I sat straight in the chair across from him, pulled out the folder from my bag. It had the deed, Walter's death certificate, and a copy of our marriage license just in case. "I'd like to talk about changing the beneficiary of my property," I said. "It's currently in my name only. I want it to stay that way, but when I pass, I'd like it to go to a different place than originally planned." He blinked, nodded slowly. "All right. Have you considered to whom?" "Yes." I opened my notebook. On the first page was the name of the organization, Hearth Haven Foundation, a local nonprofit I'd heard about through a neighbor. They helped elderly women who had been displaced, some from family conflict, some from economic hardship, some simply forgotten. I want the house to go to them, to be used as housing. For someone like me, maybe, but without the polite silence and shared spaces that aren't truly shared. Mr. Colby leaned back in his chair. "Well, that's a very generous decision. Have you spoken to your family about this?" I met his eyes, calm, steady. "No." He gave a small nod, the kind professionals give when they sense the story is longer than time allows. We spent the next hour going through the formalities. He explained things in careful, digestible pieces. I took notes, signed where necessary. I asked questions. I wanted it to be airtight. By noon, it was done. Not filed yet, but the paperwork was ready. It would be submitted in 2 days. He promised to send me the notarized copies once processed. I thanked him. I meant it. As I stepped back out into the drizzle, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was private. I went to the small cafe across the street, ordered a bowl of lentil soup and a half sandwich, sat by the window, and watched the umbrellas pass by. In my coat pocket, I could feel the shape of the folder. Still warm. The house would be someone else's someday, not my daughter's, and not by mistake. I waited 2 more weeks before I did the rest. Not because I was unsure. No, that part was sealed the moment I stepped out of Mr. Colby's office, but because I wanted to move carefully, quietly, without ceremony. One Thursday morning, after Mike had left for work and the kids were at school, I stood in front of the joint bank account screen on Caroline's home computer. She had made me an authorized user when I moved in, just in case, she'd said. I'd never touched it without asking. That day, I didn't ask. I withdrew all my funds, every cent I had put in over 3 years, my portion of the rent, the groceries, the utilities. The calculator beside me bore silent witness as I double-checked the sums. I didn't touch their money. I wasn't cruel. Then I paid their rent in advance for 2 months, quietly, as if settling a bill, as if I had been a tenant in my own home. I printed the receipt and folded it neatly into an envelope addressed to Carolyn. That afternoon, I visited a real estate agent. Her office smelled of air freshener and laminate. She was chipper, spoke quickly, and asked questions like, "How much natural light do you need?" And, "Would you like to be near a bus line or a park?" I told her I needed 3 things: quiet, privacy, and a place that was mine. She showed me 4 studio apartments over the next 3 days, all small, all modest. But the third one had something the others didn't: a wide window facing west and a single armchair tucked into the corner like it was waiting for someone to read in it. I signed the lease that Friday. The next week was a blur of soft movement. I packed in the early hours, while the house was still asleep, one box at a time, starting with the things no one would miss: books, my sewing kit, old photos. Caroline never noticed. Or perhaps she noticed and thought I was just decluttering. The movers came on a Saturday morning, 2 quiet men in uniforms. I had told them precisely what to take. They were in and out in under an hour. I left a note on the kitchen table. Simple, no drama, just a sheet of paper, folded once. "You said this was a guest spot. Thanks for reminding me. I'm not a guest. I just left." Beside it, I placed the pie dish, empty, clean, polished, not as a symbol, just as something that no longer had a place. I took one last look at the house from the sidewalk. 3 windows, slightly fogged, the front porch light still on from the night before. I remembered Walter planting the azaleas. I remembered Caroline's birthday parties, the way Owen once ran naked through the sprinkler, Ellie learning to ride her bike in loops around the driveway. I remembered everything. Then I turned away. No one saw me leave, and that too felt right. The studio apartment smelled like fresh paint and quiet. It was small, certainly smaller than any place I'd lived before. Just one room, really, with a kitchenette tucked along one wall and a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in. But it was mine, entirely. No shared calendar taped to the fridge, no unspoken rules about space. I unpacked slowly. I hung 2 framed photos on the wall, one of Walter in his garden, kneeling beside a line of stubborn tomatoes, and one of me holding Caroline as a baby, back when she still needed me for everything. In the corner by the window, I placed the one chair I had brought with me, the same one that used to sit in the sunroom of our old house. It was faded but solid, comfortable. I sat in it the first evening with a cup of chamomile tea, and the city's hum below me, gentle and impersonal. The next morning, Saturday, I rose early. I dressed slowly, put on earrings, and combed my hair with intention. Then I walked to the local bakery down the block and bought a small apple pie. Not mine, not homemade, but good. I placed it carefully in a paper bag and returned home. I sat on my stool by the kitchenette and opened my notebook. This time I didn't write expenses. I wrote intentions. Read more. Begin with the history books I've always meant to open. Sign up for that senior art class at the community center. Join the library again. Keep Wednesdays free. For myself, the pie sat on the counter as a quiet witness to the new beginning. Later, I would bring a slice to the woman down the hall, who had smiled at me in the elevator. But for now, it sat untouched, not ignored. I did not feel lonely. I felt light. That afternoon, as the sun angled through the window, I remembered that it was Saturday, the day Caroline usually deep cleaned the house, the day I usually vacuumed under the couches and disinfected the doorknobs and folded the towels just the way she liked. Instead, I folded my own towel in half, set it on the bar in the bathroom, and sat back in my chair, a novel in my lap, my feet tucked under a wool blanket. I didn't check my phone. I hadn't turned it on since I moved. In the kitchen, beside the pie, I left another note for myself, written neatly on a square of yellow paper. You're not invisible. You just needed to step out of the wrong room. That evening, I lit a candle and read until midnight. And for the first time in years, I went to bed without feeling like I was in someone else's way. It began that same evening, just after the city lights had flickered on beyond my window. The first call came at 7:48 p.m. I didn't answer. I was watering the small plant I had brought from the old house, a peace lily that used to sit near the front door. It seemed happier here already. The second call came 15 minutes later. Caroline. Then again, and again. By 9 p.m., the screen was filled with missed calls and unanswered texts. Mom, where are you? Why is all your stuff gone? Did something happen? Call me back now. The next one was from Mike. Linda, we just found your note. Please explain. We're all worried. Then Ellie. Grandma, Mommy is crying. Are you okay? That one made my hand hover over the phone. For a long second, I considered it. Then I set it down. By 10:30 p.m., I heard a knock at the door. Not loud, but persistent. I peeked through the peephole. Caroline stood there in a coat, looking smaller than I remembered. She was holding her phone in one hand, scanning for a signal, or maybe courage. I didn't open the door, not because I was punishing her, not because I didn't love her, but because the choice had already been made, and I needed the silence to be heard. She knocked 3 more times, called my name once. Then, eventually, she left. I watched her walk back down the hallway, her heels clicking sharply on the tile. The next morning brought more calls. Owen, Caroline again. Even Mike's mother, a woman I hadn't spoken to in 2 years. Messages now edged with confusion, some with panic. Why didn't you say anything? You didn't have to leave like this. We can talk. Let's talk. But no one had really wanted to talk before. Not about how I felt. Not about the weight of the shared space. Not about the slow subtraction of my presence. And now, suddenly, my absence was loud. It was the only voice they couldn't talk over. In the stillness of my apartment, I opened a new book. I made tea. I sorted a drawer. I went for a short walk and bought oranges from a corner store where the cashier smiled and asked how my day was going. I wasn't hiding. I was existing. Everything that had belonged to me, books, heirlooms, documents, savings, had come with me. Everything left behind had belonged to them already. There was nothing to reclaim. They had what they needed. Now, so did I. There wasn't much room in the new apartment, just enough for a twin bed, a reading chair, a lamp, and a small shelf where I kept a dozen books, 2 photo frames, and my sewing kit. But I didn't need more. I didn't miss the space. I missed silence on my own terms. And now I had it. Each day settled into a rhythm, small, manageable, mine. In the mornings, I made oatmeal with brown sugar and raisins. I opened the window just a crack, enough to hear the birds from the tree outside. I watched them hop from branch to branch, unbothered by my stillness. By late morning, I would go to the community center down the block. They offered classes, free or nearly free, and I signed up for two: history through personal letters and beginner's sketching. At first, I didn't speak much, just listened. But one day, during a discussion on Civil War correspondences, I offered a thought, just a small observation about how loneliness seeps through even the proudest of writing. People nodded. One woman, Doris, came up afterward and asked if I'd be joining the potluck next Friday. I said yes. On Wednesdays, I reserved the afternoon for myself. I didn't make plans. I simply read or sat by the window or sorted through old photos, letting memories come and go like visitors who didn't need to stay. Sometimes I missed the children, especially Owen's bad jokes and Ellie's habit of braiding my fingers when she was tired. I thought of them often, but they hadn't reached out again, and neither had Caroline, not in a real way. Only once did I receive a letter. It came folded in three, handwritten, not typed. I don't know how to feel about what you did, but I know it hurt. I guess I didn't see you. Not really. I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say. Caroline. I placed it in a box with other things I wasn't ready to let go of, but no longer needed in front of me. I didn't reply, not out of anger, but because the door wasn't closed, it was just no longer wide open. One Friday evening, after returning from the potluck, I had brought potato salad, which disappeared entirely. I sat on my chair with a warm blanket and a glass of water. I looked around my room. There were no echoes of someone else's footsteps, no background hum of a dishwasher I wasn't allowed to load incorrectly. There was only quiet, and in that quiet, I didn't feel erased. I felt intact. It had been exactly 1 year. I knew not because I marked it on a calendar or lit a candle to commemorate the occasion, but because the air smelled the same. That early spring scent, still cool but laced with something hopeful. That barely there floral note that comes from the trees blooming too early, from grass beginning to press upward through thawing earth. It was the kind of morning that whispered, "You survived another winter." I left my apartment late, a woven tote bag on my shoulder with a paperback, a water bottle, and a letter I meant to drop at the post office. I took the long way, past the park, through the cobbled back streets, by the rows of townhouses where neighbors planted tulips in square wooden boxes. It was a walk without purpose, or rather, with a purpose I hadn't yet defined. And then I saw her, Carolyn. She was outside the corner grocery, staring at a head of romaine like it had personally offended her. Her hair was up in a messy twist, something she never would have worn in her corporate days. She had bags under her eyes, and in her cart were 2 frozen pizzas and a box of instant coffee pods. The Caroline I remembered had once insisted on imported espresso and made her own vinaigrettes. She didn't see me at first. I stood still, just watching her, not judging, just taking in who she had become. And maybe that's when she sensed it, how people sometimes feel eyes on them. She looked up, and for a second, her face did not register mine. Then it did. She froze, her hands still resting on the cart. For a moment, I thought she might pretend she hadn't seen me. But then she let go of the cart and stepped forward. "Mom," she said, her voice thinner than I remembered. "Carolyn?" She looked at me for a long time. Not just my face, but my clothes, my tote bag, my shoes, trying to read what kind of life I had now, trying to fill in the blanks she hadn't bothered to ask about over the past 12 months. "You look well," she said finally. I nodded. "I am." A silence stretched between us, elastic and heavy. She exhaled. "You could have said something." I tilted my head slightly. "I did." She blinked. "No, I mean, before you left. You could have talked to me, told me how you felt." I did, I repeated, just not with words you wanted to hear. Her eyes filled then, not dramatically, not like a woman falling apart, just quietly, like a faucet with a slow leak. She nodded, and her shoulders sagged as if something had slipped from them. I didn't mean to make you feel that way. I know, I said, and I did. I truly did. That had been the hardest part, knowing she didn't mean harm, that it wasn't cruelty, but neglect, the kind that grows like ivy, slow, beautiful, and choking. You were always there, she said, and I just kept assuming you'd stay. Yes. She looked away. Ellie's been asking about you. Owen, too. I didn't know what to tell them. Tell them I think of them, and that I'm fine. She hesitated. Would you want to come over sometime, just for dinner? I paused, not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted her to suffer, but because I knew myself now in a way I hadn't a year ago. I knew what I would and would not allow, and going back, even for a night, would not serve either of us. No, I said gently, not yet. She swallowed hard, then nodded again. Okay. Then she surprised me. She stepped forward and hugged me, lightly, hesitantly. But she did, and I let her. Not because I needed her forgiveness, but because I no longer needed her permission. We said goodbye like two people parting at a train station, not certain if we'd see each other soon, but no longer tethered by unspoken pain. When I got home, I set down the tote bag and looked around the apartment. Sunlight was flooding the floor in long golden stripes. My chair was where I had left it, angled just right. The peace lily had bloomed again. I made myself tea, opened the window a crack, and sat in the chair. And I thought, I didn't leave out of spite. I left to preserve what was left of me. I hadn't taken my seat back. I had found a new one no one could take from me, one where I belonged, and this time I would not be getting up.